What's going on, everybody? Welcome back into the Fantasy Football Fellas YouTube channel. My name is Lucas Wenzel, and today we are talking about 8 players that you should absolutely be starting in Week 10 of the NFL season. If you have a start-sit question for this week, you can leave it down in the comment section below, but my number one rule is that if you leave a comment, if you've been here before, you have to respond to a comment as well. We want to be a community that helps each other win their leagues. Before I dive into the list, though, if you haven't subscribed to our channel already, make sure you do that. Make sure you turn on that notification bell as well. That way you will be alerted when all of our new videos are out. Videos like this, we have 2 podcasts a week, daily shorts, so much content coming out for you all. So before I dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications. Without further ado, though, let's dive into the starts of the week. 2 players at each position: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end. And we are going to start with the quarterbacks this week. Our first quarterback start is Jared Goff at the Los Angeles Chargers this week. Now, I'm typically not a fan of Jared Goff in road games. I've stated that in starts of the week before, where I have favored Jared Goff in home games, but I'm willing to take the shot on him in this game because this is going to be in SoFi Stadium, a covered stadium. And Jared Goff has actually been good in covered stadiums this year. He's got nearly 1,100 passing yards, has a 72.2% completion percentage, 106.5 passer rating. Like, those are good metrics. I'm fine leaning into Jared Goff for that game. And this game against the Chargers, my gosh, it has points written all over it, right? 48.5 is a projected point total for this game. That is the highest of any game this week. And on the season, the Chargers, they've given up the 3rd most air yards per game to quarterbacks, the 2nd most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. They are last in schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, and they have allowed the most passing yards per game this year at 313 yards. Now, if you look at the last 2 weeks, though, you'll say, actually, you know what? The Chargers have looked pretty good against quarterbacks. But then you realize it was Tyson Bagent and Zach Wilson, okay? Like, neither of those dudes are Jared Goff. So I'm not a fan of road Goff again, but frankly, in a covered stadium, in a game that has points written all over it, Goff is averaging 40 passing attempts on the road this year. I think this game has massive potential to shoot past its 48.5 point total. And Goff is going to need to put up points against this Los Angeles Chargers offense that will also not hesitate to put up points. So I am starting Jared Goff this week. He is a top 7 play for us this week at the Fantasy Football Fellas. Let's move on to our next quarterback start of the week, though. Brock Purdy and the San Francisco 49ers. They visit the Jacksonville Jaguars. And as you comb through quarterback matchups this week, it's honestly really tough, right? Obviously, you have the injuries to guys like Anthony Richardson, Kirk Cousins. But then you have Patrick Mahomes, Tua Tagovailoa, and Jalen Hurts all on bye this week. And so that's why I think Purdy can slide into the top 12, if not top 10 quarterbacks this week. Look, Purdy struggled in week 6 and 7. He bounced back in week 8 before the bye, though. He put up 20 fantasy points against the Bengals and a quarterback 11 finish that week. But outside of those 2 games where he struggled in week 6 and 7, I mean, the guy had scored 20-plus fantasy points in 4 of his last 6 games before the bye, In 4 of his last 6 games before the bye. Oh my gosh, I can't even spit that out. In 4 of his last 6 games before the bye, Brock Purdy had put up 20-plus fantasy points. Just to reiterate that clearly for you all. And now I love the spot for Brock Purdy this week. Fresh off of the bye, Jacksonville, they are 10th in fantasy points per game allowed to quarterbacks this year. They were allowing the 4th most passing yards per game, the 2nd most air yards per game as well. If you need a guy just to get you through this week, if you have a Mahomes, a Tua, a Hurts, I think Purdy is going to be your guy this week, especially if you want someone who has top 10 upside this week. So I would lock in Purdy. I love the spot against Jacksonville. We're going to be talking about this matchup a little bit more later in the starts of the week. But for now, let us turn to the running backs, where our first running back start of the week is Rhamondre Stevenson of the New England Patriots. Over in Germany, Guten Tag to our friends over in Germany. Look, Rhamondre's been on fire recently. Top 15 running back in 3 of the last 4 weeks. He has 6 targets and 4 receptions in each of those 3 games. He's found the end zone twice over the last 4 weeks. Now he finds himself in a prime matchup with the Indianapolis Colts to maintain that hot streak. Indianapolis, they have allowed the 4th most fantasy points per game to running backs this year. They have allowed 3 running backs to score 15 plus in their last 3 games. And on the season, they have allowed 7 running backs to top 15 fantasy points. Now keep in mind this Patriots offense, this is still without Kendrick Bourne. And Rhamondre should continue to get featured in the passing game. I mean, I'm just piling up all the dominoes here for them to all fall over and give you a potential top 12 finish again from Rhamondre Stevenson this week. Wheels up. Again, I say top 12. He might even be top 10 in PPR formats. He is a lock into your lineups. You can expect a big week from him. Let's move on to our second running back start of the week now. Javonte Williams of the Denver Broncos. They visit the Buffalo Bills. Now, sometimes I feel like we give this Bills defense just a bit too much credit. Not necessarily saying they're overrated by any means, but they've been below average against the run this year. 9th most fantasy points allowed to running backs this year. They are allowing 4.6 yards per carry to running backs. That is the 4th highest in the league this year. They've allowed the 10th most rushing yards. And, if you thought, wow, they're not that great against the ground, running backs get it done through the air too. They are top 7 in targets, receptions, and receiving yards allowed to running backs this year. Now, I just spat out a bunch of numbers at you, but to boil it all down, Javonte finds himself in a quietly good matchup here, and he's been getting the lion's share of the touches recently. Well, obviously last week in week 8 in Kansas City, not last week, their last game in week 8 against Kansas City. Obviously snow is a big factor in that game. Probably wasn't going to find a ton of success through the air, but Javonte Williams, 30 opportunities in that game. He saw 72% of the team's rush attempts per our friends over at Matthew Berry's Fantasy Life. If you haven't checked out Matthew Berry's Fantasy Life yet, make sure you do that. I'll throw that down in the description of this video. They have a ton of great tools. You can find our weekly pick'em slips over there. We put all of our pick'em slips in over there so you can see what we're interested in, what you even want to potentially fade. I'll leave it up to you. But they have a ton of great tools. Make sure to go check that out. And back to Javonte, he's topped 80 rushing yards in his last 2 games as well. And the icing on the cake, he's caught 3 passes in those games. So Javonte is getting a ton of volume. He's doing something with that volume. He's got a great matchup with the Bills. Just to simplify all of it, you have Pacheco, you have Mostert, you have Swift all on bye. Again, quietly, Javonte Williams could slide into the top 15 running backs this week. He just misses that mark for us, but don't be surprised if Javonte Williams finishes top 15, knocks on the door at top 12 this week. The opportunity is there for him against the Buffalo Bills. Let's move on to the wide receivers now. Calvin Ridley is our first start of the week at wide receiver. I told you we were coming back to this game, and all offseason, I refused to hitch my wagon to Calvin Ridley. I started creeping up towards the end, but I can never get myself all the way there like others in the industry were. And for the most part, that's worked out. He only has 3 games with more than 14 fantasy points this year. He has more games outside of the top 50 wide receivers than he does inside of the top 30. But this matchup with the 49ers now, I'm looking to start him in. I've seen a lot of people actually around the industry identify Christian Kirk as the guy to start at Jacksonville this week, which let me say this first before I dive into this argument. Christian Kirk is a fine start this week, but I don't think he's the primary start. I would actually rather play Calvin Ridley over him this week. The 49ers, they've given up the 4th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this year, so it's a great spot for both players. And Kirk is clearly the number 1 guy against zone coverage for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And the 49ers, they run zone 77% of the time. Just for context, the league average is right around 71, 72%. But unfortunately, I don't think we can just stop at that conclusion and say, there you go, Christian Kirk's your guy. Because you look at where these wide receivers are lined up and where the 49ers are allowing fantasy points to in terms of formation. The 49ers have given up the 3rd most fantasy points to wide receivers lined up outside since week 5. That's where Calvin Ridley is lined up. And in contrast, then they've given up the 7th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers lined up in the slot during that stretch. So with Calvin Ridley being primarily on the outside and Christian Kirk in the slot, look, again, I think they both can have nice days, but I'd rather play Calvin Ridley in this game. I just would. I'm more interested in him. I'm comfortable starting him as a wide receiver 2 in leagues this week. I think the matchup is there. This game is going to be high-powered. I like Calvin Ridley in this spot this week. I would fire him up as a wide receiver 2 in your lineups. Speaking of a guy who I would also start as a wide receiver 2 in my lineups this week, how about DeAndre Hopkins of the Tennessee Titans? They take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this week, and I'm hoping week 9 is a sign that the Titans, are honed in on getting DeAndre Hopkins more and more involved and utilized in this offense, with Will Levis now at quarterback. Even though they only caught 4 for 60 last week, he drew 11 targets. That was tied for the second most in a single game this season for DeAndre Hopkins. Excuse me. And week 8 wasn't all that long ago. Let's remind ourselves, 4 for 128 and 3 DeAndre Hopkins went for in that game. That's only 2 weeks ago. And now we draw the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. In Tampa, they have allowed the second most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this year. The third most receiving yards. 14 yards per reception. For context, that's 6th most. 10 receiving touchdowns in 8 games. I almost said 8 and 10 games. 10 receiving touchdowns in 8 games for the Buccaneers they have given up. And not to mention, I found this wild for Jamie Eisenberg over at CBS. Love a lot of Jamie's stuff over there. Over the last 2 weeks, the Bucs have allowed 6 over the last 2 weeks wide receivers to top 14 fantasy points. 6 of them over the last 2 weeks. This is a great spot for D-Hop, man. He should be starting in all lineups, no questions asked. He is by far a lineup lock this week. Fire him up. Wheels up on DeAndre Hopkins. All right, let's bring it home here with the tight ends now. About 11 minutes in. Trey McBride, the Arizona Cardinals, is our first tight end start of the week. If you're scared off by Trey McBride's week 9 performance, that's a mistake. You're going to look really silly on that one because Clayton Tune was playing quarterback, okay? He had no chance. There was no chance in the Cleveland Browns. They were only allowing 5.9 fantasy points per game to tight ends going into that matchup. There was no hope for Trey McBride, okay? Don't write him off, though, because now he gets a much better matchup with the Falcons in Week 10. They have allowed the 8th most fantasy points per game to tight ends this year. They have allowed the 8th most fantasy points total to tight ends this year. They have allowed the 3rd most receptions to tight ends, which, if you want that extra boost in PPR formats, there you go. 3rd most receptions to tight ends. And now Trey McBride gets Kyler Murray back at quarterback this week. That is confirmed now. It's no longer speculation. Kyler Murray will start for the Cardinals in Week 10. So in an offense that's been great for tight ends this year and a good matchup with a quarterback improvement to Kyler Murray, look, Trey McBride is a top 10 option across the board for all 3 of us, fellas. Fire him up this week. He should be in your lineups. All right, let's bring it home now, though. Our final tight end start of the week, Taysom Hill. The New Orleans Saints, they visit the Minnesota Vikings this week. And now at this point, you can't not start Taysom Hill. I mean, you are literally getting a quarterback, running back, and tight end when you throw them into your lineup. So what do we want to call that? A quarter running end? I don't care what you call it. But you're getting a guy who literally does it all for this offense, and he has been extremely hot coming into his matchup with the Vikings. 20-plus fantasy points in back-to-back games. Tight end 6 or better in each of his last 4 games. Now, it's tough to look at the matchup stats here for Taysom because on the one hand, the Minnesota Vikings, 9th most fantasy points allowed to tight ends this year. But on the other hand, Taysom Hill has been utilized more as a running back, 9-plus carries in each of his last 2 games. They're allowing the 10th fewest fantasy points to running backs. I honestly don't think it matters that much, though, no matter which way you look at it. Look, Taysom should be starting in all formats this week. He's going to be involved. If he finds the end zone, he's automatically going to be probably a top 12 option this week, and he has just been too hot. So you've got to play him this week until he gives you a reason not to. Taysom Hill is our final start of the week at the tight end position. And that is all I have for you. Thanks for tuning in to this video on the Fantasy Football Fellas YouTube channel. Again, if you haven't subscribed already, make sure you do that and make sure you turn on that notification bell as well so you can be alerted when all of our new videos are up. Waiver wire video, trade targets video, the starts of the week video, 2 podcasts a week, daily shorts, Monday through Saturday, plus a live on Sunday. You'll be alerted of all of those things if you subscribe and turn on that notification bell. And again, if you do have a start-sit question this week, you can leave it down in the comments below. But my number 1 rule, make sure you respond to somebody else's comment if you leave a comment down below as well. We want to help each other win leagues this year. But again, that's all I have for you. Thanks for tuning in. We will see you all next week. Well, we'll see you tomorrow in our shorts, but we'll see you next week. We'll kick off the week with the waiver video, the podcast on Tuesday. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and deuces.